I'm apparently live. There's a bit of delay. If you could just let me know in the comments if I'm coming through, we'll start talking. Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we are discussing the ongoing horror in Ukraine, Russia's cruel and unreasonable and completely just uncalled for invasion of Ukraine. Specifically, we're going to talk about the chances that Ukraine might have to actually defeat Russia and punish Russia for this incredible horror that it has committed. Any rational person at this point still will look at this question that we're asking today: can Ukraine beat Russia? And say, obviously not. There does not seem to be any chance of them actually winning this conventional war. And I think that's still the case. But what is interesting is just how poorly the Russian military is performing. The Russian military is likely to meet its goals eventually, but it's been quite striking over the past 2 days just how unimpressive the Russian military is and how different an entity it is than what we've been led to believe for the past couple decades of sort of fear-mongering about Russia. That said, it's a horrific conflict, and we should try to endeavor to take it seriously. But this is a very interesting story that I feel that folks aren't covering enough. If you're new here, what goes on is I have a presentation that I want to make. I'm going to talk about the current state of affairs within Ukraine. This is the sort of my not very good map that I've done up about what's going on there. I have a couple observations I want to break out. Honestly, a couple apologies for how wrong I got some predictions about what was going to happen with Russia and Ukraine. So we'll do that for about a half hour, 45 minutes. And during that period of time, I will not be paying any attention to the chat. You need to pay attention in the chat to Logo Cool Extreme. He is our moderator. Whatever he says goes. You are invited to say anything you want about me, about the topics being discussed. It is wartime, so if you're being overtly genocidal about one of the Russians or Ukrainians, then Logo will exercise discretion about whether what you're saying is appropriate and allowable. Yeah, you're allowed to say anything you want about me, anything about the issues discussed. I ask primarily that you be civil to each other. I ask primarily that you be civil to each other. Do not get into fights in the chats. Do not be disruptive to the chat. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. If Loga decides you're being disruptive, he will warn you. And if you don't respond, then he will block you. I don't have a ton of time while I'm trying to do this presentation, to look at the chats. If you have super chats, questions that you need to be asked, you really want me to answer, you can do a super chat, but only after the Q&A period has started. I just generally don't have the mental bandwidth to pay attention to both. So with that, let's pile into this. Let's start talking about what's going on here. I think the first most important thing to say is I've been conscious this morning as I've been looking into this, and I've gotten more and more excited about intelligent things that I can say about this. I think I'm getting distant from the real horror of what's going on here. We have a massive shooting war. I don't have a lot of sympathy for people who are like, can you believe this is happening in Europe? Which I find, honestly, that kind of statement, I find, I think not vaguely, quite racist, in fact. This idea that, this is the sort of thing that's supposed to happen in Africa, the Middle East. I can't believe it's happening in Europe. That doesn't appeal to me much, because chiefly it's the United States making these things happen in the Middle East and Europe. So that whole line of discussion bothers me. But there is a special horror to what's going on in Ukraine, because what we haven't seen really this century so far is something more akin to a peer-on-peer combat. That's what I found most surprising about this conflict. I was expecting more of a sort of U.S. versus Iraq situation where the Russians were quickly dominant. That's the kind of military we've been led to believe that Russia has. Instead, what we're seeing here is more of a cage match between two militaries that are much more evenly matched than you might imagine, and I think than anybody had imagined. And it's very clear, it's very likely that the Russians will win, but it's clear that it is going to be a much longer journey to that victory than they had expected. And what this means, this is not a small civil war. This is not a civil war with just, even on the level of Syria, where you've got militia, the Syrian government, the most high-tech thing they could do was drop barrels full of explosives out of helicopters. Both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries, while it's becoming clear that not even the Russian military has, the more impressive aspects of 21st century technology in large numbers, what we have here are two 20th century style armies vastly outmatched. The Ukrainians are vastly outmatched, but it is a real conflict. And the casualty numbers that we're going to see here, we're beginning to see casualty numbers from the Ukrainian government, their ideas of how many of their own people have died and their ideas of how many Russians have died. These numbers are vast underestimates. These are only the folks that the Ukrainians can say with confidence have died. Their estimates of how many Russians have died are probably overestimates at this point, but their estimates of how many Ukrainian civilians and soldiers have died at this point are vast underestimates. As we get into this and we start talking about the state of the conflict, it's incredibly important to remember that this is not a fucking video game. There are hundreds of people fighting and dying in a vicious conflict. It's the sort of essentially imperialist conflicts that the United States engages in the Middle East and Africa are horrific. There are absolutely, as we've learned more and more in recent months, there have been horrific examples of the U.S. slaughtering innocents in large numbers. But what you have to realize is the argument when we want to keep the Pentagon accountable for the slaughter of innocents, which happens every now and again, it's in the context where the United States is so incredibly dominant in these conflicts that what's most important isn't, some international institution or what the people we've been fighting say. It's like internal legal wrangling within the U.S. government as to how, what our appropriate response to people we've killed or how many people killed it should be. What we've got in Russia, and I think more than anybody, what we've got in Ukraine, and I think more than anybody really appreciated, is a much closer to a peer-on-peer conflict, which means that the kinds of horrors that we're rightly reading about in the New York Times, 15, 20, maybe even a dozen incidents, maybe even hundreds of incidents over the past, certainly hundreds of incidents over the past 20 years. All of those incidents, all of those horrors can be compressed into an afternoon of fighting in Ukraine. So while I have no sympathy for people like, can you believe this is happening in Europe? I think it is worth pointing out that what is happening in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, is a horror that the world hasn't seen much of since the Iran-Iraq War. I think is probably the most direct comparison. That was two powers that were not evenly matched, but within the same realm of each other. The United States hasn't fought a conflict like that since World War II. Europe hasn't seen a conflict like that since World War II. Even Yugoslavia, the problems of the conflict were mismatches. This is so. Yeah, sorry, I might be belaboring this a point too much before we get into it, but this is fascinating stuff. War has a way of clarifying things. I tend to learn more about the countries. The period at which I learn the most about countries is when they're at war, when they are fighting, because there's a part of the human mind that becomes intrigued. But we must recall, we must keep front and center that people are dying here in a truly horrific conflict. And that's something we have to pay attention to. I'm going to answer this one question from Nikhil Attar. because he did a super chat, but please hold off the super chats until we get to the Q&A period after I finish the presentation. You mentioned the U.S. promised to back Ukraine if war started. Obviously, they would never have. Is America winning weapon sales to NATO intentional? I mean, obviously, the United States is benefiting to an extraordinary amount. I talked about this in a produced video on Tuesday. The amount of weapons we're going to sell in Europe are just absolutely going through the roof. Is this intentional? No. I mean, I don't think this was a sinister plot from the United States. I think what it is something a dynamic we've seen constantly in U.S. foreign policy for the past 10, 15 years is you've got the real adult in the room. And I would say compared to the U.S. military-industrial complex, even Donald Trump was the real adult in the room, who restrains, and Congress to an extent does this as well, restrains the sort of Washington, D.C. foreign policy establishment that makes all kinds of commitments that the U.S. public and the U.S. government was never going to honor. We see this over and over again. In Syria, the way that they've committed the U.S. government to the Kurds, and we have honored that to a degree, but the Kurds will eventually be betrayed, have been betrayed, will be betrayed further. And basically the foreign policy establishment that attained way too much power in places like CNN and MSNBC over the past 4 years, made all kinds of promises that misled the Ukrainian leadership to believe that they would have more support than they have. So let me get back to the presentation. There's another huge super chat that I have to answer, but please let me... well, Adam of Good, welcome to the live chat. Thank you for that very generous thing. I will look out for questions of yours later on, but I want to get to this presentation. I think the first most important thing to say with any analysis is that I was wrong. For, I think, possibly the first time in the history of this YouTube channel, the 8 years I've been doing this, I think for the first time, I was wrong and the U.S. intelligence community was entirely right. That is a difficult thing for me to admit, but it is true. So let's look at this map here. I did not think that we would see an incursion in Ukraine from Russia of the scale that we have. What I expected was large-scale bombing throughout the country. What I expected was a Russian military or air force that was much more capable than it actually is. I expected the Ukrainian military to be quickly wiped out all over the country, and then almost all of the real business of this war to be done over in the east of the country. You'll see on this map here, we've got Luhansk, Donetsk, Kramatorsk, Mariupol. I'm sorry, I apologize for the mispronunciations of all of those. I expected the business of this war between Ukraine and Russia, if it happened, to be here. I also said that I did not expect. I also said I always remained open to the idea that Russia would do this, but it was like, oh, 5% they'll do this, 95% they won't. Over the past couple weeks, before the last 36 hours, I was part of that crew of people who made fun of the U.S. government and the U.S. intelligence community and their panic-inducing BS. Complaining that they were making it seem like a military incursion was much larger possibility. I was wrong. I was deeply wrong. And the U.S. intelligence community was absolutely right. Putin was as ambitious as they had predicted, maybe even more so. Truly horrific. I said a siege of Ukraine, a siege of Kyiv, that's ridiculous. There's no way that Russia would put itself in that risky a position. That's never going to happen. It's happening. It's happening right now. The U.S. intelligence community was right, and I was wrong. That is incredibly humbling thing for me to be saying, if you know anything about this channel. And I think the Biden administration, but even beyond Biden administration, the U.S. intelligence community, something that I mock really heavily, has done very well over the past couple weeks. And was absolutely right about what Russia was going to do. It's painful for me to say that, but I think it's something that has to be said. What has been so shocking, what has been so surprising in the initial war plans of the Russian military is the way that they have doubled down, tripled down on a sort of World War II type approach. I expected Russia to attain dominance in the air to dominate the airspace immediately. They haven't done that yet, 36 hours later. And it's apparent that they knew they didn't have that capability because, again, to my embarrassment, they are using tanks. They are using armor to make a ground offensive and a massive ground offensive on Kyiv. They've captured Chernobyl, which is a very strange thing to capture. It is a nuclear wasteland. They have captured Chernobyl, and they are within 50 kilometers of Kyiv. They have made a massive assault on Chernihiv, not even going to Chernihiv, up in the north. They have failed to take it. They have made a massive assault on Kharkiv. They have failed to take it. Their most successful push is from the south. They have control of Crimea. They have controlled Crimea for 8 years. It is, according to the Russian government, it is now part of Russia. That's the little bottom on the bottom in the south there. They had a massive armored push up from the south. I think perhaps it seems likely that the Ukrainian government was most surprised by this push because it seems to have gotten the furthest. These initial attacks by Russia in the north from Belarus, directed at Kyiv, from the south, I guess directed as far as it can get up there, I guess probably attempting to drive towards, is it Dnipro? A city that I did not put on this map. That attempt up from the south seems to be going very far, but I think by this point, 36 hours in, it's quite clear that they have not met their objectives. It's been a very interesting information environment for very good reason. The shock and awe of this Russian offensive from the north and south is taking up most of our reporting. Information is what we hear about the most, but there's very little discussion of what's going on in the east with Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, Kramatorsk. These are places that were supposed to be, in my mind, the most important aspects of the conflict. My expectation was that Russia would attain dominance of the airspace, destroy Ukrainian military elements all around the country, perhaps do some terror bombing of Kyiv. That was my expectation. Well, my expectation was the majority of his forces would be protecting the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, the breakaway pro-Russian separatists that have sort of controlled Luhansk and Donetsk for 8 years. And I assumed that the massive battlefronts would be around Mariupol and Kramatorsk, which are, I believe, still held by the Ukrainian military. I believe this imbalance in reporting is something that's serving us somewhat poorly. I was desperately looking this morning for information about Kramatorsk and Mariupol, about the east of the country. And I think what you have to understand is that the vast majority of our, I would assume the vast majority of the fighting and the resources on both the Ukrainian and Russian parts are being thrown into the east, because that's sort of part of the point. Part of the point is on Monday, Putin declared the independence of those republics, possibly with an eye towards annexation to Russia, but maybe not. Russia's really benefited from having independent non-Russian republics on the territory of Georgia for, I guess, decades now. Regardless, that's where the things were supposed to happen. And I think certainly Mariupol, and I believe Kramatorsk as well, are areas that are claimed by those separatist republics. So it would make sense for the Russians to come in and take that. That's where I thought the real balance of fighting was going to happen. And to be clear, that is where the real balance of fighting is happening. What we're seeing, I believe, around Kyiv and coming up from the south and the Crimean Peninsula, what we're seeing there is a massive Russian offensive. There's certainly a lot of material involved there that is in the process of sort of flaming out. What I believe we have going on right now in the East is essentially World War I. It's I think the weight of the Ukrainian military is fighting there. There's been a lot of sort of somewhat inspiring stuff about how They're handing out machine guns to the Ukrainian population in Kyiv and in Kherson, Odessa. That's because the Ukrainians didn't expect to be fighting on the ground in Kyiv and Kherson and potentially they might have expected towards Odessa. They expected to be fighting in Kramatorsk and Mariupol, and it seems thus far that the Ukrainian lines are holding in Kramatorsk and Mariupol. So this is surprising to me. I would assume that the vast majority of the death and destruction is going on in the east, but because it's less dramatic than the battle for Kyiv, the battle for Kharkiv, the battle for Chernihiv, the strange decision by the Russian military to prioritize Chernobyl. That's all very dramatic. That's all got a higher density of people with cell phones on the ground that can send us inspiring footage or terrifying footage or what have you. Whereas out in the east, we've got a hyper-militarized grind of a place where I assume most civilians have already fled. Mariupol and Kramatorsk, two Ukrainian cities. It's a particularly hard, have been on the front line for 8 years now. It's a particularly hardy type of individual who's going to stay in Kramatorsk and Mariupol. Famously, Russia evacuated most civilians from Luhansk and Donetsk. I think what's going on over there, what is likely to continue going on there, even if the Russian offensives on Kyiv and up from Crimea are defeated, what's going to go on over there is going to be truly, truly horrific. I expect it already is. I expect that the amount of death that's occurring over there is already massive. But what's interesting is, well, there's a number of things that are interesting here. In the short term, I think U.S. intelligence agencies have utterly beclowned me and have been correct about Putin's willingness to to truly attempt to conquer the entire country. That's let me qualify that. There's a whole bunch of cities over here, a whole bunch of population to the west of Kyiv that I didn't even bother putting a city on here. There has been bombing. There has been Russian bombing, and this I expected, of the entire country, of military resources in the west of the country. But if Kyiv were to fall, Zelensky, it's president, right? The president of Ukraine and the rest of his government could, I believe, retreat into the vastness of Western Ukraine, and it wouldn't even be like an insurgency. It would be an actual much akin to sort of Stalin retreating during World War II. And I believe there's plenty of space for the Ukrainian government to have a sort of government away from Kyiv if the Russians manage to take it. But I think, so as I was saying, I think the U.S. intelligence community was entirely right, utterly beclowned me on the intentions of the Russian military and what it thought it could get away with, what it thought it could achieve. What I think the U.S. military industrial complex, the U.S. intelligence community has led us astray on for the past 20 years is this idea that Russia is a terrifying 21st century military machine, because that is emphatically not what we are seeing in this conflict. 36 hours, and I now trust the U.S. intelligence community in the short term, over 36 hours into this conflict, I guess we're coming in, over 36 hours into this conflict, the Russians do not own Ukraine's airspace. That is very surprising to me. They have failed to take Kharkiv. Kharkiv is, I believe, I meant to look this up, but I think it's a top 5 Ukrainian city. Tremendously diverse, history of tremendous diversity, but it's got a lot of Russian speakers. If Putin's delusions that, the Russian military were going to be welcomed as liberators, if Putin's delusions of that were going to be true, Kharkiv was the place where that was going to be true. The Russian military has failed utterly to take Kharkiv, which is 30 miles from the Russian border. Apparently, I don't know, I haven't researched this as much, but Chernihiv, another, is that the Belarusian or the Russian border? Another city very close to the border, another big city that Russia attempted to take, has failed to take that. To be clear, I never expected, certainly in this phase, I think I now do expect it. I think I now do expect horrific street-to-street urban battles, but I don't think I expected it at this earliest stage, and I don't think the Russian government expected it at all. I think the Russian government was expecting that, oh, they send in their military and get to the outskirts of these cities, and then the vast majority of Ukrainians who want to be Russian take over their cities, and da, 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 da. That's not what they're getting. We're now seeing Russian advancements into the heart of Ukraine that look and are very impressive. But what they're doing on the way is they're not taking cities. They're bypassing cities. So I think anybody who's ever read a history of a conflict or played a video game can tell you that while this is something that, works, if this is a week-long conflict maybe, and they manage to knock out Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, having all of these very long supply lines with very hostile major urban environments in the middle of that, that's not something that's going to fly. That's not something that's going to work long term. So what I think I have been most surprised by was the extent to which the Russian military is not a 21st century military. To be clear, the Russians have always been very careful, this goes back to Soviet times, have always been very careful to sacrifice an extraordinary amount. I ran a video a couple years back talking about just the body count of Russian military testing. Just that it seemed like there was a period a year or so back where it seemed like every month the Russians would kill 5 to 10 nuclear scientists or military techs in this effort to stay at the cutting edge. And I don't doubt that Russia has hypersonic missiles that are very impressive, is sacrificing a lot to stay at the technological cusp of nuclear weapons technology. But what I didn't really appreciate, and I think is becoming very clear, is that yes, Russia is at the cutting edge with a lot of the technology, but they don't have these technologies in numbers. They have precision-guided munitions that are probably, close to as impressive as anything the United States has, but they don't have many of them. They have cruise missiles. They have drone technology. They have the capacity in a very small way, as I think we've seen in Syria. This is an example of, Russia coming in with their sort of top-of-the-line 1990s military and making huge, huge differences in a conflict that is distinctly 1930s in its technology. This is in Syria. But in what I was expecting, as I said before, I was expecting this Russian fight against Iraq to be a sort of, this Russian fight against Ukraine to be a sort of US versus Iraq situation. Iraq in the 90s, Iraq in 2003 famously had a whole bunch of tanks and a whole bunch of military equipment, but just didn't have they had the ability to take territory, but they didn't have the ability to compete with the United States on a technical level. And I didn't think Ukraine would have the ability to compete with Russia on the technical level. To be clear, they don't, unfortunately. And I think this leads very likely to will lead very shortly to the complete destruction of Ukrainians' conventional military forces. But I expected the mismatch to be much bigger than it is. It is not a large mismatch. I think I have humiliated myself the most, probably with a short on YouTube and a video on TikTok saying, tanks don't matter. This is stupid. Tanks are ridiculous. Why are we talking about tanks in the 21st century? Russia's a real military. They're not going to be using tanks like it's 1941. And I was wrong about that. And that video is still going viral on TikTok, which I think it's got over 100,000 views on TikTok, which is quite humiliating because I was completely wrong. Russia does not have a 21st century military. Again, it makes sure it's on the cutting edge, but it doesn't have these technologies in large numbers to be able to be used. The United States can pisses away billions and billions of dollars making sure almost every munition is precision guided. I mean, that's oversold to a degree. We are, there's a less precision than we like to sell, but there is no precision in what the Russians are doing in Ukraine right now. To be clear, there were some things. They took out some things, but they didn't take out enough. Ukraine still has fighter jets at this point. Who expected that? I don't think they have many, to be clear, but they still have. Ukraine still has serious air defense capabilities. 36 hours into this conflict, that is shocking to me. That is shocking to me, and that's why the fact that Russia is attempting to take Ukraine primarily with tanks and then with some planes that fly overhead and are certainly, dominant, but like I don't know what they're doing. It's like I said, there's a history of this. I think since 1949, Russia has been a nuclear power, or the Soviet Union was a nuclear power, and was very careful, would sacrifice an extraordinary amount, as Putin has sacrificed a lot of potential economic development in his pension system to attaining a certain level of technical capability in the Russian military, but not technical capability in quantity. Famously, Kennedy said there was a missile gap. The Russians had more missiles than us. And they really, really, really didn't. They did not at all. In the 1960s, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the United States was almost infinitely beyond the Russians in terms of the quantity of nuclear weapons that we had. Russia did make it into orbit before we did. They had a satellite up there before we did. But then when it came to gutting to the moon, we just simply, turned a fire hose of money on it and beat them there. So Russia can do these really impressive technical feats because they're willing to suffer to do it. But when it comes to the application of a major war, as we're seeing in Ukraine, it's not there. The Red Army is still like a 1942 military in terms of its ability to achieve its goals. If that military ran into Poland, where we have sold the Polish, and the Polish have been able to develop for themselves some very serious modern 21st century military capabilities. I mean, there's literally tank columns. I think the most famous example of a tank column of the past 30 years of warfare is probably the Highway of Death. Is that how it's known? When Saddam Hussein's military was retreating from Iraq, the U.S. military decided to destroy it. So what we've got, if Ukraine had, a 21st century military, some 21st century capabilities, you've got these armored columns of tanks, exactly the sort of thing that was annihilated in Iraq in the 90s, snaking towards Kyiv right now. If Russia tried that shit, if Russia tried that shit in Estonia, you'd have a Highway of Death situation. It's really stunning how few capabilities the Russian military has demonstrated here. It's not a real military. I think yesterday morning I sort of ran this short, assuming like out of horror that, oh my God, Russia's about to take Ukraine. We're going to have to massively enforce the Baltics and Poland and this, that, and the other thing. Not against this military. Nope. That is not a threatening military that we're seeing here. We are seeing a military that is very likely, almost guaranteed, to destroy the rest of Ukraine's forces. I think it's still, 80-90% likely to win the battle for Kyiv. But it's going to get a lot more horrific. It's going to get a lot nastier. This is much more of a pit fight than Russia wanted or was expecting. Russia's military has been demonstrated to be quite lightweight, frankly. It's a museum piece. If you're sending armored tank columns, this is not a military that can. This is Saddam Hussein. Like Vladimir Putin's Red Army looks a lot like Saddam Hussein's mother of all battles military from the 1990s. That's an overstatement, but not much of one. Um, Unfortunately, I believe it is very likely that Russia will win out in Ukraine. That's still the most likely result. Though, I mean, I'm actually seeing somewhat respected, I think I've retweeted some of it on Twitter, somewhat respected US military analysts being like, well, actually, I don't know. Russian military was expecting a cakewalk, was expecting to be welcomed in a friendly manner. Instead, they've got grandmas telling them to fuck off and die. That can't be fun. I think it's very true that only a third of the forces arrayed around Ukraine have been committed to the battle in Ukraine. But a lot of as we know, a lot of those forces, that one third of Russian forces that have been committed to the battle around Ukraine, are, presumably some of the highest tech, most impressive, going to get the job done easier or better forces, right? They haven't gotten the job done. I think it was a really huge moment last night in the United States, I suppose, when it became clear that the Russian special forces, with their snazziest helicopters, had taken an airport around Kyiv, and if they had held that airport, then it would have been very quick and easy. Russian transport planes took off with massive reinforcements and armor that could have been used to take Kyiv probably by this time, and the Ukrainians took it back. Russia is a 20th century military. It's a big, nasty 20th century military beating up on a smaller 20th century military, and it's likely to win. But yeah, it's really really quite striking. Now there are a couple caveats to this. For sure, Russia is going easy on the Ukrainians. They care about the Ukrainians in a way that they do not care about the Afghans or the Syrians that they've been bombing. There is a real Putin himself has put out a lot of propaganda around the idea that Russians and Ukrainians are brothers. It's just this crazy regime that's keeping us from being pals. Most of Russia and Ukraine, Putin is right in saying that Russia and Ukraine are incredibly intermingled places. There's a lot of families that are Russian and Ukrainian. There's a lot of, I think it's some more akin to, well, I don't want to step into that minefield, but they're to some extent, sort of whether you align yourself with Russia or Ukraine is in many cases a choice you can make. And it was a choice before Russia started this invasion 8 years ago. And certainly, 48 hours ago before it became infinitely more horrific. There were higher numbers of Ukrainians who were more, this is in 2013, who were more interested in, aligning with Russia or being friendly with Russia. It's a group of folks that are, close to each other in a lot of ways, which means that Russia was hoping to do this, was hoping to take Kyiv, decapitate the government, put in a puppet, and then be friends with the Ukrainians again. Whether or not certain aspects of the country were incorporated into Russia, so they aren't going fully scorched earth yet. I think as it begins to look more and more like their offensives on Kyiv and coming up from the south, as it looks more and more like those are failing, then we're going to see a lot of scorched earth. This is going to get much more horrific. The body counts, we're going to see Russia going in. Well, I think we are now seeing Russia attempt to go into Kyiv. Things are going to get so much worse, so much worse. If Russia is successful in taking out President Zelensky, doesn't matter. I think there's a lot of, it's very weird. I just watched a clip today with Petro Poroshenko, who's a guy I have historically had very little respect for. This was a president of Ukraine. I still see him as a corrupt oligarch. I still see him as too far in bed with the United States. But yeah, I mean, it was quite moving because it was interesting seeing him at a sort of barrier in Ukraine, pleading in Kyiv, pleading for more information. I don't know if I think Poroshenko was sort of mocking it up for the video cameras, but I mean, there's a real sense, that this guy knows he's going to die, and knows he's going to die for a cause that's going to win. And who knows? I mean, Poroshenko. My image of Poroshenko is someone who probably hop on a run off with a armored personnel carrier full of gold or something. But he's certainly that picture that he presented of somebody who was willing to die for Ukrainian independence is something that very much exists. Of course, we've all heard the story by this point of those 13 soldiers who, I mean, goosebumps just talking about it. It's 10, 11 soldiers who were, I guess, what little a navy that Ukraine had, an island off of Odessa. The Russian Navy came and was like, "Hey, listen, this is a Russian military vessel. We're gonna, in the name of saving lives, let's, why don't you just surrender?" And the 12 guys on this island with no real way to defend themselves said, "Hey, Russian vessel, go fuck yourself." I mean, that's the kind of thing that Russia is up against right now. And I think Putin really believed, I think other people in the Russian establishment really believed that once they just got rid of these sort of U.S. purchased oligarchs and leadership, that the Ukrainians would be delighted to be welcomed back with open arms into Russia, and that is not what's happening here. I think it is extraordinarily likely that we're going to see this conflict get much more horrific. We're going to see the remainder of Ukraine's conventional military destroyed. But I think that Ukraine will keep fighting, and this is a really horrific gamble that Putin has made with Russia, and it already appears to me that it is failing and failing miserably, and it is illustrated that it is not much of a military. That it is illustrated that the hypersonic missile, cyber EW warfare, magic place that Russia has been sold to us as is not a Russia that exists. So there. To be clear, I absolutely believe that Russia is hiding capabilities. No question. There are, they have more tricks up their sleeve. They have more weapons. They have more tactics that they could use. That's true. It is true that up to this point in the conflict, Russia has been going somewhat easy on the Ukrainians because they don't want high levels of Ukrainian casualties, because that will look bad to the Russian public and on the world scene. However, those two caveats, I feel like, just don't make up for how unimpressive the Russian military has been thus far. This is going to be really horrible. It's going to be really horrible. But I thought the assumption was that this would be a horrific demonstration of Russian capability. My assumption even was that if it happened, that this would be a horrific demonstration of Russian capability, an indication that European defense had to finally get serious. I don't see anything serious about Russia's claim to be a 21st century military at this point. That doesn't mean it can't commit horrific things, and importantly, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have nuclear weapons that it can't use to wipe out human civilization. That's another issue and a different issue. But yeah, Russia's conventional military forces, deeply unimpressive. There we are. Okay, so I think that's what I have to say. That's my presentation. We're going to move on to questions. Oh, wow, we've got a bunch. Sorry. Oh, okay. So thank you, Christopher Murtaugh, for that super chat. Thanks, Rob. Got to run. We'll watch playback. Just wanted to show my appreciation. Oh, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. And then I think that's okay. That's all the super chats. Okay, so we are now with 200 viewers, wow, on YouTube and 400 on TikTok. Nice to see you, folks. It's now time for questions and answers. If you send me a super chat on YouTube, your question will get answered. Will China invade Taiwan? Actually, Jan, I'm not sure. That's a great question. I did a short on it this morning. So if you just click on YouTube, you can check. There's my answer there. Put very shortly because super chat. As the energy transition made it much more likely that Russia would take this risk, that Russia would take this action. Oil and gas prices are very high in Europe this winter, possibly for the last time. I think Russia can see the writing on the wall and knows that no matter how many few capabilities it has, it needs to use them now. This was sort of their last chance to invade Ukraine. I don't know, maybe next winter we'll have a similar oil and gas price problem, but I would be surprised. Certainly this action by Russia is focusing a lot of minds on how humiliating it is to be as dependent on Russia for oil and gas as they are. What this means for, what the energy transition means for China, however, is the opposite. China is not a massive, it is actually a massive producer of oil, gas, coal, etc. But it's such a massive consumer that they have to suck in resources from other places too. China is making a huge push for renewables that is changing the world in massive ways. I know many people are still skeptical of renewables. I don't think that's merited. I don't think you should remain skeptical of renewables. But what nobody's skeptical of is the fact that China is going to be building 150 nuclear reactors over the next 10 years. So 10 years from now, a lot of the stuff that China relies on oil and gas for is going to be replaced by nuclear. You can make an argument, I think there's some truth to it, that you will still have massive imports to China of fossil fuels from other places. But the first thing they're going to do with those 150 nuclear plants is harden their military industrial complex, find better ways to provide energy to their military capability, and just add to resilience in the Chinese system. So with every year that passes, Russia was going to look less capable of carrying out an invasion of Ukraine. And with every year that passes, China becomes more capable of taking Taiwan. I think a lot of people make the point that's very valid that I've made the point that China's period of massive economic growth has slowed or even not stopped. But, this in 2022, the expectation is that that China and the United States are going to have economic growth within 1 or 2% of each other. China is not rushing ahead with the speed that it once was. And that makes people think that an invasion of Taiwan is more likely. However, I think, I just read this a couple weeks back and it really was very persuasive to me. The fact that China's building out of its nuclear and renewable infrastructure is only going to continue improving their position in terms of an ability to carry out an invasion of Taiwan, the ability to survive any blockades of fossil fuels, makes me believe that a Taiwan invasion as a relation to this Russia-Ukraine thing, especially as the Russia-Ukraine thing gets more and more embarrassing for Russia, I just don't see it. I just don't see it happening. Will China invade Taiwan? I mean, they intend to, they threaten to, but I don't see, after the revelation in November of 2021, was it October of 2021, that the United States had remilitarized Taiwan. We have US soldiers on Taiwan again. This is something that was revealed in the Wall Street Journal and then nobody ever talked about again. Yeah, it's not this decade. I don't see China invading Taiwan this decade. How much will the West prop up the Ukrainians? The U.S. has provided. I assume I'm back. Okay, reconnection successful. If someone wants to let me know in the comments whether someone wants to let me know in the comments whether I'm coming through all right, whether I hope I'm coming through all right. Let me know if I am or not. Um, the U.S. Has been supporting Ukraine to an extent. The United States' main approach and main concern, which I believe should remain its main approach and main concern, is not getting into a nuclear war with Russia. That's very, very important. I think there's an open question that, should we be supporting an insurgency once the Ukrainian military has been defeated? I'm not sure we should. So I think what happened was the Ukrainian establishment, Zelensky, looked at what the United States was saying about Russia, how angry CNN and MSNBC and the Democratic Party were about Russia for 4 years. And I think the Ukrainian government got an unrealistic expectation of what the United States was going to be willing to do for them. So we have provided arms. We are doing some sanctions. But what's really interesting is over the past couple days, it's been shown pretty clearly that we're not going to do the massive, horrific, killing the Russians' economy sanctions. We're definitely doing some stuff around banks. We're going to crush some individual banks. We're doing some stuff around finance. We're actually going to block imports of certain semiconductors and whatnot to Russia. That's something that's going to happen. It's something that is happening. But not only is Europe continuing to buy oil and gas from Russia, because at this point they have to. The Germans, I think, get 50% of their oil and gas from Russia. You just can't stop doing that. Because of that, and also the United States, because it started a embargo of Venezuelan oil 3 or 4 years back because of Trump's sanctions, started buying, I believe, 500,000 barrels of Russian oil every day, and we're still doing that. So not only, yeah, we're supporting the Ukrainians, we're putting up, yellow and blue flags on all of our, public architecture. We really care about Ukraine. We're also funding Russia's war machine. The Europeans are doing it. The Germans are doing it. The United States is doing it, funding Russia's war machine. So it's this very weird set of affairs where I think there's very real anger and very real disgust with what Russia is doing, and we're expressing it in all kinds of ways that don't cause any problems for the United States, which is, not super cool. So, yeah. Does this strengthen or weaken the EU? That's a great question. I think that it's weird, despite the European Union, as I was just discussing, not doing much to actually economically fight Russia, the drama of it, the power of it, the power of this savage Russian hordes coming in and murdering all these poor Ukrainians can't help but push European countries closer together. I think that Poland, it is interesting. I haven't looked into very much what Hungary's position is here. I think it's got to be pretty awkward. We're already seeing a lot of sort of Russia-friendly political figures in the United States back off of it. I think we'll even probably the next couple days we'll see a statement from Trump even being like, "Oh yeah, fuck Russia." But a lot of Republicans are backing off this sort of Russia love they've had historically. But I think in the coming, it'd be interesting to see what Hungary is up to. But Poland and the European Union have had a really rough couple of years. European Union doesn't agree with Poland's immigration policy, doesn't agree with Poland's policy related to the judiciary. I assume that whole controversy is just gone for now. That's not, I think there were already sort of processes that were proceeding against Poland in the European Union bureaucracies. I expect those to be paused. I expect those to slow down, if not stop entirely, because the EU has something to fight against. And I think from the United States perspective, I think there was a lot of excitement, still remains a lot of excitement's perhaps it's not the word, but grim resolve around fighting and confronting Russia. I think that Russia's poor performance is sort of indicating that actually Russia isn't much of a conventional military power. But from the European perspective, it's still terrifying to see. It's still a horrific thing that's happening in Europe. It's still a bunch of charismatic Ukrainian victims who sort of fetishize the European Union. So yeah, I think that does strengthen the European Union. Also, I believe that it is humiliating. It is politically embarrassing, and it is politically heavily covered within Europe that all these European politicians are in bed with Russia. The European energy systems are incapable of truly sanctioning Russia, and I expect real movement on that. We've already got European politicians resigning from Russian boards en masse. Europe has, in many, many respects, been a world leader in decarbonization and in moving away from fossil fuels. I expect that to accelerate. And a lot of that, you know, I mean, one of the main things in energy transition is sharing energy transmission. You know, I mean, it'll only serve a number of EU agendas. High prices in this is, I think, interesting. Oil industry is loving this moment, but I feel like oil industry propagandists are sort of hardest hit by this Russian action here. I think in a way that I wouldn't have the same amount of anger here, but I think it's actually true that the energy transition, the push for renewables, has resulted in higher oil and energy prices for sure across Europe and the United States. I actually think that's a good thing. But I think that a lot of oil and gas industry propagandists were very excited because they saw an opportunity to blame the high prices on green energy specifically. Russia, by actually doing this invasion, has made Russian aggression the most obvious reason that oil and gas prices are higher, and has given a tremendous, tremendous push towards European decarbonization efforts, to European green efforts. So yeah, I mean, those are some thoughts there. McKay says, how does Russia intend to hold Ukraine after the invasion? It seems like 44 million people would be difficult to all control long term. I still don't believe that's the Russian plan. The Russian plan is not to hold all of Ukraine. The Russian plan is to install a puppet in Ukraine to get to browbeat, or I think they'd be open, might be becoming more open to browbeating. Actually, no, I thought we saw some opening 3 or 4 hours ago. Now it seems unlikely. They might be more open to browbeating Zelensky into demilitarizing. No, I think they want to kill Zelensky, or they want to, want to do a show trial for him or something. But I don't think Russia's plan was ever to fully occupy the whole country. Again, they're never gonna. It'll be sort of like, was it Vichy France or whatever? There's large swaths of Western Ukraine that they're not even gonna. There's not going to be a single Russian soldier in. There certainly have been Russian missiles. There's the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. I can bring back the map one last time. This part out here, Luhansk and Donetsk have been de facto Russian occupied for 8 years now. I think the intention was to push the Luhansk and Donetsk republics out to the borders they claimed, to take Mariupol, take Kramatorsk, maybe take the whole Black Sea coast. I think that was what Russia wanted to do. And even if everything started going really amazing for them, that'd be as far as they'd end up occupying. But yeah, what was the plan? What were they thinking? That's a real parallel to Iraq 2003 that I think we're definitely seeing here. It doesn't seem like there was, I think the plan was really to be welcomed as liberators. And that is just not happening. at all. I think that was the real Russian plan. It was like the George W. Bush plan. They're going to love us after we blow up all their cities. Absolute insanity. Yeah, because you have to understand Putin and even a lot of Russians writ large believe that Ukraine is just, it's just, it's a part of Russia that got confused. And we just need to kill the people who were confusing them and everything would be fine. I think, even Putin has to be aware at this point that that is not the case. And yeah, again, like, I do not believe that Russia, even in its most maximal gains, if everything went right. I think if everything went right, Russia wanted to pile in 36 hours ago. They'd have taken Kyiv by now. They'd already have some figures in the Ukrainian military who wanted to work with them. They'd have a puppet government. The West would maybe there'd be some civil war between the West and their puppet government, and they could heavily arm it, and that'd be fine. But no, like the Russian military simply wasn't up to it, the level of resistance they've experienced has been too high. To be clear, I mean, this time tomorrow, Zelensky could be dead, Zelensky could be captured, Kyiv could be rubble that Russia controls, but they didn't want to reduce Kyiv to rubble. They wanted to sort of waltz in with some paratroopers, install a puppet government, declare victory, and get the hell out. That is not what Russia's doing. I think it's probably a little oversold, the idea that Putin is vulnerable. But yeah, if this goes on for another couple weeks, they're pretty vulnerable. The Ukraine estimates that only a couple hundred Ukrainians have been killed, which seems insane to me, insanely low to me at this point. They have provided estimates of how many Russian soldiers they've killed that are probably way too high, but they suggested yesterday that they'd already killed 3,000 Russian soldiers. That's probably too high, almost certainly too high. Is it still too high today? I don't know. Russia is attacking. Russia is sending helicopters full of their guys, some of which are getting shot down. They have had multiple examples of sending soldiers in to take an objective where they've been driven out by Ukrainian counterattacks. So it actually does make sense, just from a simple offense-defense type situation, for the Russians to be dying in much larger numbers. I believe that the Russians really expected to have achieved many of their goals by now, and are now experiencing, the 3,000 is overstatement of how many Russian soldiers have died, probably. Is 1,000 an overstatement? No. I think probably in this Russian invasion of Ukraine, they've probably already lost half as many soldiers as the United States lost in 20 years in Afghanistan. Russia is famously a very populous place that, can use bodies like cannon fodder, but that was Russia in 1945. That's not Russia today. I mean, Russia's got a fertility rate that's, around the level of Japan's. Many of these kids who are dying are, the only child of parents and grandparents. I do think that there's going to be very real I think it's probably more likely that we see some kind of humiliating Russian back down, and Ukraine is suffering enough that, perhaps they'll make some commitment to Donetsk and Luhansk autonomy or independence, and say, fine, we won't join NATO. Ukrainian demilitarization is completely off the table. I think if Zelensky tried to agree to that, he'd be shot by somebody in his own barracks, I assume. Russia. The answer is Russia doesn't hold Ukraine after the invasion. I think their intention was to enlarge the autonomous republics or independent republics in the east. I think that was always their goal. Yeah, there was never a real threat of Russia taking all of Ukraine and then attaining a border with Poland and Romania again. Yeah, that was not going to happen. Super chats. There were more super. I missed some super chats, didn't I? Oh yeah, I missed a lot. Okay. Is this strength or weekend? Brando Commando says the defense of Sumy held and is now under Ukrainian control. It's amazing. Yeah, the defense. So Sumy, which I did not put on the map, you have to understand. Like this is an incredibly wide offensive from Belarus across all this Russian territory here. There are, to be clear, we haven't talked about this much. Russia entirely controls the Black Sea and has managed to. Ukraine does not have a navy, or it had a navy, and it is now gone. But that is that is true. Russia is the clearly sea dominant, or what have you. But across this north and east of Ukraine, we have seen we truly have seen an armored offensive of the nature that Europe has not seen since the 1940s. It is a truly massive, massive thing. As I said, the Russians have failed to take Kharkiv. They have failed to take Chernihiv. They have failed to take Sumy, which I believe Sumy was. Brando Commando mentions the defense of Sumy. Sumy was is another city that's just 53 kilometers. That's what, like, it's like 25, 28 miles away from Russia. It is humiliating for the Russian military that they have been incapable of taking these places. It's quite stunning. Yeah. Let's see. Also, it sounds like Zelensky is staying in Kyiv. He'll likely be killed along with pro-Ukrainian parliament members. Incredibly sad, but courageous. Yeah, I don't see. If I were Zelensky, well, I would never be Zelensky. I don't have that kind of courage or charisma. But if I were Zelensky, I would be taking off for that great Western Ukrainian area to keep the fight going. But yeah, if Russia takes Kyiv, which is, of course, remains by far the most likely result, President Zelensky will be killed. Yeah, these are a wide range of people, certainly people in political power. The mayor of Kyiv, a lot of headlines about the heavyweight boxer mayor of Kyiv and his brother are going to go fight for Kyiv, fight and die for Kyiv. Poroshenko claims it's going to do that. I don't know. Yeah, it's incredibly sad and courageous and inspiring. There's a great tweet. Someone says, "Wow, Russia really seems to be hell-bent on recreating all of the the most charismatic stories from Russia's resistance against the Nazis, except they want to run it again where the Russians are the Nazis." It's quite insane. But yeah, it sounds like Zelensky is staying in Kyiv, which is unlikely to work out well for him. Will Nord Stream 2 ever be operational? Probably not. Ask Staro Pulsaro. I think that, well, I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say. What Russia has threatened is that they will cut off gas to Germany, because Nord Stream 2 is just the second pipeline that goes through the Baltic Sea and directly from Russia to Germany. So I think that Russia is already threatening to reduce gas supplies to Western Europe because Western Europe is refusing to take more gas supplies. The Germans are lazy, and the Germans like making money off of the Russians because it's easy. But if the Russians were to seriously make the Germans uncomfortable with oil and gas, I think we would be astounded at the progress that renewables would make very quickly. So yeah, I don't know that. I think Nord Stream 2 might become operational. That would probably, I would support that being part of some kind of deal to get Russia to give up its offensive. I can't say definitively that Nord Stream 2 will never be operational, but I think I can say definitively that it's not going to be operational for very long. Yeah. I think that's what I have to say about that. Let's see. Got another. Did I get all those? I got Star Pulse, I got Brandon Commando. I got make sure I don't have super chats. Okay, it's got logs. Okay, thanks again. Sorry to be greedy with the super chats, but I have many questions. Hey, man, it's not greedy. That's It's, I needs to eat, and I'm grateful to people with super chats. Thanks again. Sorry to be greedy with the super chats, but I have many questions. Was there even a possibility that Ukraine could have joined NATO? No, there was not. Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, so NATO accession is one of those things that the United States just doesn't think about. Just like, oh, okay. Like literally, it was a promise. We promised Gorbachev we wouldn't do it. Then I think Bill Clinton had like some meeting with some charismatic former dissident, now government member of, I don't know, Czech Republic or Poland or something, and was like, yeah, sure, you want NATO? Let's do NATO. That sounds easy. And that's pretty much been the mentality of U.S. NATO expansion from, the 90s up until 2008. What Russia did in 2008, when after saying, we really hate this, please don't expand NATO, you promised us you wouldn't expand NATO, please don't do this. And then in 2008, Bush pushed really hard to add Ukraine and Georgia. And then the Europeans apparently blocked the actual invitation, but it was clear that the U.S. was interested in this. At that point, Georgia simply invaded Ukraine and beefed up the autonomous republics. And you can't, it's really hard to add a country to a military alliance if it is actively in the middle of a war. And Georgia, and since 2008, Ukraine, have both been in a position of actually being in a war. So even now, I think, unless the Ukrainians push Russia out of the autonomous republics, which nobody thinks is going to happen, it'll be the same problem. We can't. The thing about NATO is NATO includes a commitment to defend NATO members with nuclear weapons. So at this point, if NATO were to join NATO, at this point, if Ukraine were to join NATO, I think we'd be obligated to nuke Moscow. So if Ukraine were to join NATO, this really isn't an overstatement. It's just nobody ever says it because very few people in Washington, D.C. think much. If Ukraine, and people are proposing, oh, let's just add NATO right now. Let's just add Ukraine to NATO right now. Let's do a no-fly zone. Like what these people are suggesting, and I don't think they know what they're suggesting, but what they're suggesting is World War III. NATO, under Article 5, there's a commitment. I don't think it says you have to use nukes, but practically speaking, were we to add Ukraine to NATO right now, the logical next step as a treaty requirement would be to nuke Moscow. And that's, of course, the end of human civilization. So that's really, that's the problem here. Like, I'm inspired, as I hope I've made clear, I'm inspired by what Ukraine has done here. I'm inspired, I think that I've gone from someone who spent a lot of time talking about Russia's legitimate grievances to now somebody's like, yeah, fuck yeah, murder sanction Russia, let's do it. Very quickly. I mean, this is a horrific thing that Russia has done, but it is still unequivocally the case that the most important aspect of the U.S.-Russian relationship is that they are the only two countries on the planet that have the potential to end human civilization. So, honestly, would it be, if Russia really had a serious military and was like turning towards the Baltics, like, I guess if Russia invaded the Baltics, we would have to end human civilization, and I believe in the U.S. government keeping its commitments. So yeah, I guess it's hard for me to really encompass that. Like, would I support World War III to defend the Baltics? We said we would. We're committed. I believe in contracts. Is my belief in contracts worth ending human civilization? That's a really interesting question. But yeah, we are committed to defending the Baltics to the extent of the end of human civilization. I don't want to commit us to do that for Ukraine or Georgia. I think it's a bad thing that we committed to do that for the Baltics, but we did completely unthinkingly because Clinton and Bush and Obama and Trump also expanded NATO, believe it or not. Just do what can only exert power in certain ways. Anyway. Would a U.S.-less NATO be viable? Why or why not? So France, in particular, has been trying to set up what is essentially a U.S. a sans U.S. NATO for a decade now, and the United States keeps obstructing it. It's like a US, an EU defense option. It's weird. I think was it Malta was talking about this, like that the EU is sort of through the back door developing a unified military force in Frontex, just the frontier defense. Basically, the fucking border patrol is the first European military is the fucking border patrol. But France has, for a decade at least, been trying to set up something more serious, and the United States keeps blocking it. So yeah, I mean, in theory, would a NATO without the United States, or just an yeah, an EU military force, be capable of replacing NATO? Of course. The European countries are some of the richest countries in the world. They also have real military-industrial complexes. They are 14 times, I think, together. Their GDP is 14 times the size of Russia. If there were any interest in Europe for standing on their own 2 feet for defensive purposes, they'd do it. But they'd be more than capable of it. But they're not interested in it because the United States wants to keep doing it for free because the US government and people who work in it benefit immensely from defense contracts, from the ability to sell F-35s to Finland and Denmark and the Netherlands and Italy and Poland and all these other places. So yeah, of course, European defense architecture without the United States would be viable. It would clean the clock with Russia, its only potential enemy, and yes, Turkey as well. So yeah, of course it's viable, but it's just not going to happen. Adam, oh, that's an interesting question. Is Ukraine the new Yugoslavia, except it's Russia breaking it up instead of NATO? Well, what's interesting about this particular bit of outside aggression is that Russian aggression, I think, is solidifying Ukrainian nationalism. It's, I think, knitting Ukraine more closely together. I think a point that can be oversold, but I think is very much worth making. There are plenty of Russian native speakers in Russia, in Ukraine, who have decided to be emphatic, massive supporters of Ukrainian nationalism now. That's like a decision that people make. Yeah, so I don't see Yugoslavia as fragmenting. I see it as consolidating. I don't know if this was loose talk from the Russians or just sort of an assumption was, oh, well, one of the things that Putin could do is he could attempt to, he's going to set up the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, which are splitting up Ukraine in a Yugoslavia fashion, and then he could go further and he could set up a Kharkiv republic. He could. Sorry, I think up until yesterday I was calling it Kharkiv, but it's Kharkiv. He's got the Luhansk and the Donetsk republics out in the Far East. Well, then he's going to go and get Kharkiv, which is also closely bordering on Russia, and that'll be another divided republic. Well, the Russians have failed miserably to take Kharkiv. Again, they didn't expect that they were going to do massive, horrific urban warfare to take Kharkiv. They thought that they were going to come in and blow up some Ukrainian military elements, and then the Kharkiv people were going to be like, "Yes, Russia, we're happy to be here again. Let's set up a new republic." And that ain't happened. That ain't happening. That did not happen. Seems very unlikely to happen. So weirdly, the Russian invasions have massively consolidated and given more power to Ukrainian identity, which is not the result that Putin wanted. Another aspect of the actual conflict, don't get me wrong, the Yugoslav conflict was horrific. Wars between Serbia and Croatia, the genocide in the Balkans, genocide in Bosnia, horrific stuff. Some of the worst, certainly some of the worst stuff in the latter 20th century. But we're talking about, all told, Yugoslavia. What was Yugoslavia's whole population? I don't know, 15 million, something like that. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine, which is a country. Ukraine has 40 million people. And it's not out of the realm of imagining for Belarus, Moldova, and Russia itself. There's already been some shelling of Russia, as they deserve, being drawn further into this conflict. That's a key point. Ukraine, when it's independent, it can shell Russia. Ukraine and NATO shelling Russia means World War III. See the problem there? But we're talking about vastly more people in Ukraine than in the Balkans. And vitally, we're talking about vastly more, what's the word I'm looking for here? The military clash is much more serious. Much, much more serious. In Bosnia, we had militias. We had nasty militias, official, semi-official militaries. Yeah, some of them would have some artillery pieces, some of them this, that, and the other thing. Like both sides still, amazingly, have fighter jets in this conflict. Both sides have air defense elements. Both sides have tanks and artillery. Both sides have serious, serious capabilities. Again, much lower level capabilities than the United States has. Shockingly lower level capabilities than the United States has on Russia's part, but still vastly more capable than the forces that were operating in Yugoslavia, and with really, really horrific potential. Adam of Good asks, Lithuania gifted Ukraine 300 Stinger missiles on the 23rd. Do you think Russia could see Lithuania as its next target? No, Lithuania is in NATO. I've actually got, they're 5 years old, but I've got 2 videos. They're in if you Google MIC, Military Industrial Complex, they're in the Military Industrial Complex series that in 2015, 2016. I have 2 videos called Why Russia Will Never Touch Estonia. And I meant it to be for all the Baltics, but I just chose Estonia because that was seemed like, to me, the better SEO choice. But yeah, no, the Baltics are in NATO. And if Russia tries to do anything to Lithuania, it's World War III. So it's guaranteed. The U.S. is guaranteed World War III if Russia tries anything with Lithuania. And that's why, of course, Russia didn't want Ukraine or Georgia to avoid to join NATO. It did not want guaranteed World War III if it had any dispute with any of its neighbors. See, Adam of Good, Star Pulsaro. What is the Chinese perspective? Let's see here. True Realist asks, any change to Turkey-U.S. relations due to the invasion? Not yet. And honestly, I was very excited in talking about, just yesterday, I was talking to some Turkish college kids who invited me to their politics club or something. And I was like, wow, look at this. This is a tremendous opportunity for Turkey. We're going to see some we're going to see a huge potential rearmament of NATO. We're going to see a real staffing up of NATO. Turkey's got the biggest, I think the second biggest NATO military, just in terms of forces. Are we going to have Turkish troops defending the Lithuanian border from Russia? That was always a little fanciful. But there was a huge, looked to me yesterday like there was a huge scope for Turkish bridge building with the NATO allies with whom it's had a very strained relationship. Today, I'm less certain because Russia doesn't look very threatening right now. Russia looks violent. Russia looks cruel. Russia looks terrible. But it looks like it's got the same military with some technological bells and whistles on top of it. But it looks to be running the same military it was running in 1945, just with fewer people. Attacking the territory that used to be, part of the, Russian spirit, was part of the Soviet Union. So I don't know. I as of yesterday, when I was truly, disturbed and horrified, and oh God, I guess it's time to arm up Europe again. I was like, this could be great for Turkey, that has really broken a lot of relationships with the United States and its other NATO allies. I don't see that anymore. I don't think that's the case anymore, I'm afraid. But yeah. I mean, I don't think that's as much the case. I think that, I think I'm looking at Russia's military like it's a joke, but I don't think the U.S. government or the European governments are going to do that. they are looking at it like it's a joke when you consider the United States and Europe are still purchasing massive amounts of Russian oil and gas. But the official messaging is that no, it's a time for new seriousness and building up in NATO. And if Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, I think has the opportunity still to get in on that messaging, to get in on the let's be friends again, that to get in on like, well, I'm the second biggest military in NATO, I should be invited to these meetings again. I think there's still a real scope for that, but I don't see it as legitimate. I see it as more on the level of, I don't see it as a necessary response to a legitimate threat. I see it as like just sort of more wankery. But you know, all politics is wankery. So yeah, maybe that's a good thing or what have you. What is the Chinese perspective of Russia's invasion? This is really interesting because China and Russia usually has a pretty principled anti-intervention stance. Really, you know, likes sovereignty. China, of course, you know, got that approach from 100 years of, you know, the century of humiliation, where Japanese and European and U.S. Imperialists sort of carved up their country. But of course, China also really wants to be on. China also really wants to keep Russia on their side and really sees an interest in cultivating China-Russia relations. So it's been a, you know, sort of a weird give and take. They can't fully endorse Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's just too far against their entire political view. But what they do talk about is like, oh, Russia's entirely right about NATO, and really, it's, you know, this is, you know, we can't endorse what Russia's doing here, but sure, like this is really the NATO and U.S.'s fault. That's what's really going on here. But it would be very interesting in the coming days and weeks as this conflict gets more and more horrific, and also quite possibly as Russia demonstrates its failure to actually be as impressive a potential ally or potential satellite as it is typically described. You know, China could perhaps back off more. It'll be very interesting to watch. But yeah, so China has these conflicting things where it's usually all about sovereignty and not invading people. But it also really wants to be friendly with Russia. And of course, its evolving status on those issues will evolve with whatever happens in Ukraine and Russia. Was there another super chat I had missed with China's perspective of invasion? Let's take a TikTok question. How about that? What do we got over here? How you always put the blame on everybody else, but except the person that started the war. I think I'm pretty clear about blaming. Pretty damn clear about blaming Russia here. This is. I think I've been pretty. My approach prior to this invasion has been to point out that 100% Russia has some legitimate grievances here against NATO expansion, against the expansion of a military alliance whose goal and treaty obligation is to destroy Russia. You know, not wanting that expanded to their border. I think they've got a legitimate grievance there, but I don't think anything I've been saying today or over the past 48 hours has been blaming anybody other than Russia for this horror show. Russia, I mean, this is a crime on the level of what Mohammed bin Salman is doing to Yemen, of what George W. Bush did to Iraq. This is doesn't matter how many grievances you have. You know, I think I was said on the patrons only Discord. I have ongoing conversations with many of the people here in my patrons only Discord that you can get access to if you sign up on Patreon. Sorry. But I was having a conversation in the patrons only Discord this morning, talking about like, yeah, you can totally acknowledge, and I think it's important to acknowledge, that the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ended World War I, was very cruel towards Germany and created a lot of resentment that made World War II more likely. You can do that. You can acknowledge that. You can point out that that's true without making excuses for Hitler. And I am the last person to compare Putin to Hitler. What he's doing here is not, I believe, at all anywhere near Hitler level. But just because I know that Russia has real grievances does not mean I'm saying it's okay for Russia to invade countries. Just because I know that Turkey has a legitimate grievance against the U.S. getting in bed with the Kurds doesn't mean it's okay for Turkey to invade and occupy parts of Turkey that it's in parts of Syria that it's now occupied for 6 years. Yeah, I don't think I've been someone who's really been saying that everything is Russia is all hunky dory and it's totally okay what he's been doing. And I don't think that's been something I've been doing. Let's see. Please address the corruption in Ukraine. Yeah, again, Ukraine super freaking corrupt, run by oligarchs. There's even I think that we probably minimize too much the extent of anti-Semitism or right-wing groups in Ukraine. I think that's all true. Just because, this are like, well, Ukraine can't be anti-Semitic. It has a Jewish president. Yeah, well, guess what? The United States had an African-American president. Does that mean the United States isn't racist? I don't think that's true. And I think all that's true. Ukraine is, can be seen as corrupt. There's, way too much anti-Semitism. There's problems. Who cares? Who cares? It's a country that's being invaded by a vastly more powerful enemy. I think that, you can believe, I probably believe many more of the nasty things that are said about the Ukrainian political scene than most. But who cares? That doesn't mean you can invade them. That doesn't mean invading a country is good. Like, imperialism is always bad. The Houthis in Yemen, on my YouTube channel, I'm constantly speaking out against the Saudi Arabian and Emirati invasion of Yemen. The Houthis in Yemen are terrible fucking people. They actually have a flag that says death to Israel on it, and a curse upon the Jews. They're terrible, nasty, anti-Semitic, corrupt, weird, fucked up people. I don't care. There's still an indigenous resistance movement. I believe Ukraine is super corrupt. I believe that there's a lot more really dark nationalist anti-Semitic stuff in the Ukrainian makeup than we typically read in the New York Times. I totally believe that, and I don't fucking care. The Ukrainians today are an indigenous resistance movement. And if you are a person who values freedom, if you are a person who believes in like the individual decency of all people, then you should be against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just as you should be against the Saudi invasion of Yemen. You should be against the U.S. invasion and destruction of Syria, the U.S. and Turkish and Gulf invasion and destruction of Syria. You should be against NATO's destruction of Libya. You should be against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, it's the same thing. Like I have no illusions about the virtue. I mean, I'm developing a very soft spot for Ukrainian President Zelensky. What a terrible situation he is, and he seems to be doing a good job of being. But yeah, I have no illusions about the virtue of the Ukrainian people. Whatever the people, but the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian ruling class, there's no illusions, and I don't fucking care. They are fighting off an outside invader. They are fighting off imperialism. So yeah, like I would be right there with you, trying to make nuanced arguments. 3 days ago. Well, you got to understand, the Ukrainians aren't that great. I have totally tweets from 3 days ago to 8 years ago talking about how Ukrainian democracy, pshaw, and I think that is ridiculous, this idea that Russia's afraid of Ukrainian democracy. Like, Ukraine does not have a very impressive democracy. Even heroic Zelensky is constantly arresting opposition folks, what have you. But I don't care. Like, they are fighting off an outside invader. And if you're a person who really loves freedom, I would assert, if you're a real American, not that caring about freedom is a real, if you're dedicated to the principles that I believe are, key to the founding of, the United States and free countries around the world, you're on Ukraine's side, even if they're corrupt, even if there's anti-Semitism. That's pretty. I'm pretty clear about that. Let's see. Any chance to relations? What is the Chinese perspective of Russia's invasion? I think I did that one. Daxton Min. Rob, do you think the perception and credibility of the U.S. versus Russia or China on the world stage has improved drastically in the light of these events? I think Russia has fallen dramatically. I think China, this can be overstated, but I think it's really true. I think that even though the Russian military has proven itself to be kind of embarrassingly bad at militarying, the focus for the next year is going to be sorting out this mess, and it's entirely possible that um, the U.S. pivot to Asia, which we've supposedly been doing for a decade, is going to get pushed off for another half decade because of this. And I think that's pretty great for China. I think that talking about China has a lot of scope now to clean things up in Xinjiang. I don't mean like do genocide. I mean like figure out a way to put more of a lipstick on the pig of cultural genocide and forced assimilation that they're doing in Xinjiang. They have time to make all the legislative changes they want to in Hong Kong without much outside scrutiny. They have time to really focus on building out nuclear power and renewables. So yeah, China definitely wins out of this, no question, for sure. So China's probably the biggest winner. The U.S. honestly looks much better. Like I said, as I opened this presentation, pointing out that I was utterly beclowned. The U.S. intelligence got Russia absolutely right. For a couple weeks prior to this, the U.S. intelligence community was saying loud and clear, Russia's going to invade. It's going to be horrific. It's going to be nasty. I was mocking them for that. This is the first time in 8 years of focusing on geopolitics that I have been impressed, that I've ever seen the U.S. intelligence community get something right. So I think among people who pay attention to these sorts of things, among people who address their, who know about these sorts of things, I think there's a lot more respect for the U.S. intelligence community than we've seen certainly in 30 years, honestly. Whether that translates to growth and credibility for the United States on the world stage, I don't know. Whether that translates into more electoral success for Joe Biden, I kind of doubt it. But I mean, the U.S.'s position has changed here dramatically because of what Russia has done. Russia's support for breakaway republics and its annexation of Crimea in 2014 were bad things. I've never supported any of those things, but they were things that were defensible to the Russian public and to the world public in different ways. Like all this talk about how corrupt and anti-Semitic the Ukrainian political scene is, all this talk about, and I've indulged in this sort of thing. My Johnny Harris video from earlier this week was less into that sort of thing, but all that sort of stuff was a legitimate, and actually, to be clear, will remain a legitimate topic of concern for historians for decades to come. I don't regret anything that I've said on that, but if you had asked me who's the main aggressor in Eastern Europe and Ukraine from 1990 until the morning of 2022, February 23rd. Yeah, it's February 23rd, right? I guess it's the evening in February 23rd, 2022 for me. At any of those points, if you'd ask me who's the main aggressor in Eastern Europe, it would be the United States and NATO, 100%. Sure, Russia was backed into a corner and felt, some people, not many people in Russia, felt they had to do this stupid, violent thing, but they did this stupid, violent thing. I think you can make a case. I think people make too strong a case that that the United States forced Japan into attacking us in 1941 by cutting off the oil. And if I were FDR, maybe I wouldn't have cut off the oil to Japan. Maybe I would have. I don't know. So we're listening to was it Hardcore History's thing on what the Japanese Empire was up to. I think cutting off that oil was probably the right choice. But there's an argument there. Maybe the United States shouldn't have cut off oil to the Japanese Empire, forcing the Japanese Empire to attack them on Pearl Harbor. But once the Japanese attacked us on Pearl Harbor, that conversation was over, you know? And you know, Russia did a completely unmerited, preemptive, you know, George W. Bush style evil attack on Ukraine. So fuck them. Yeah, I'm pretty clear about that, and for my part, and I think a lot of people are getting a lot more clear about that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of sort of somewhat more Russia friendly um, folks who I agree with. Like I think Matt Taibbi, you know, is a guy who's been very skeptical about RussiaGate, as you should be. The Russia hoax, I think, is the appropriate way to call it. This idea that this completely exploded idea that the U.S. intelligence community pushed that Trump was somehow a Russian pawn. It's been shown to be complete bullshit. You're seeing a lot of those folks who were right to, I think, somewhat heroically point that out, putting out statements saying "fuck Russia." Yeah, like this is. I think China is probably the biggest winner. I think the U.S. is a winner because all the things we've been saying about Russia evil, Russia perfidy, Russia nastiness that looked so unfair 3 days ago have been confirmed. This is tremendous validation for the U.S. military-industrial complex. To be clear, I still believe that if there had been no NATO expansion, I believe Putin would not be in power. I believe that absolutely U.S. aggression helped lead to this mess, but who fucking cares? Like, up until Pearl Harbor, you can talk about maybe maybe the U.S. could have managed this relationship better. Maybe the Japanese Empire is as aggressive as it is because there are certain interactions in the 20s and 30s where the U.S. disrespected Japan in a way that wasn't helpful or useful. That's worth looking into. For sure, like U.S. empire in the Philippines was pretty awful, and etc. Like but then Pearl Harbor happens. Pearl Harbor happened. Russia was backed into a corner, and it did the dumb thing, and that makes Russia look better, and that makes the United States look better. Russia is obviously calamitously fallen in world. It's just it's impossible as someone who has seen and been sympathetic towards the grievances of the Russian regime. Yeah, I don't care. I don't care anymore. They invaded Ukraine. And yeah, of course, I'm going to, in my produced videos, I'm going to continue to tell these stories with nuance. I'm going to continue to be very against the U.S. military-industrial complex, which should be castigated for creating this nightmare in Vladimir Putin, which I believe they did. But while the Russian military is actively murdering people in an invasion, yeah. So anyway, what's with Lukashenko sending Belarus troops into Ukraine? Are they going to rejoin Russia? That's another aspect of this. Thank you, Scott, for bringing that up. That's quite fascinating and troubling. Yeah. So Lukashenko is, of course, the last dictator in Europe. As he's famously known, the dictator of Belarus, north of Ukraine, south of the Baltic countries that are in the EU and NATO. Lukashenko has been in power in Belarus for 30 years now. I think most of 30 years. I can't recall. But yeah, it's a place that sort of never, famously, and I think to the affection of some, it didn't really do any kind of reform after the end of the Soviet Union. It just sort of held on to a lot of its sort of communist approaches. Lukashenko, I think, as is his own power in Belarus, and there was a lot of talk after Ukraine. Sort of from 2014 until, was it 2019? Until the massive protest movement in Belarus, there was a lot of talk about, Lukashenko is trying to carve himself off from Putin. I think maybe that was always a little overblown. There's a lot of sort of treaty relationships between Russia and Ukraine, security relationships that are always very strong. Sorry, between Russia and Belarus. They were always very strong, but after the sort of invasion of Ukraine, which obviously, communist or not, Russia friendly or not, Lukashenko, the dictator of a former Soviet republic, is not going to like it when Russia invades a former Soviet republic, as they did, Ukraine in 2014. So I think something that people like to talk about and speculate about was like, ooh, maybe Lukashenko is going to come over to the Western side, or maybe he can be charmed over here or something. And then we had the election, I guess it was 2019 or 2020. No, it was 2020 because it was COVID had already happened. Yeah. In 2020, there was an election that Lukashenko, the latest in a long line of elections, Lukashenko clearly stole. Massive protest movement despite COVID. And at that point, Lukashenko stopped flirting with the West because he blamed the West for this incredible protest movement, this inspiring protest movement that went nowhere. So then Lukashenko got very, very close with Putin again to save himself. And now we're seeing a real implementation of that. In that, yeah, that whole Russian offensive against Kyiv is launched from Belarus. This is Belarus up here, above Chernobyl, and I don't have the map right in front of me. So I know Kharkiv is being attacked from Russia, but Kyiv is being attacked. Well, I guess there's now columns coming from Russia to attempt to encircle Kyiv. But yeah, the main brunt of the offensive against Kyiv came from Belarus, which is probably not, potentially is not something you would have seen if Belarus hadn't fallen out with the West as heavily as he did in the aftermath of the 2020 election that he stole, which is an interesting thing to think about. So yeah, Belarus. Was that? Yeah. So yeah. So what we're seeing with Belarus that can be seen as a victory for Russia is that there are now Russian troops, massive amounts of Russian troops in Belarus, and it's a very open question whether they will leave. It's interesting. One can sort of fantasize about what if the Ukrainian military really did beat the Russians, and then would they attack Belarus? They'd certainly be within their rights to do so, but that's a fantasy world we're unlikely to see. I'm surprised there honestly hasn't been, or perhaps actually Ukraine is avoiding shelling Belarus at this point because they don't want another problem. I saw the information on the specific topic. The last information I saw was from yesterday, Scott. Perhaps you're referring to something I haven't seen today, but was that Belarus, Lukashenko came out and said, we haven't sent Belarusian troops into Ukraine, but if Russia needs us, we will. It was sort of the last statement. Maybe, Scott, maybe you've seen something more serious since, but let's see here. Do we have no more super chats? Well, you've been very generous with super chats, folks. I'm very grateful. I will definitely answer your question if there's another super chat. If Russia succeeds, doesn't that mean that Taiwan is toast? Well, you have to define success there. And no, I don't think it means Taiwan is toast. What's really important about Ukraine is that there is no formal or informal U.S. commitment to defending Ukraine. That simply isn't. I think that's been a real point of U.S. policy for the past decade, is to not actually formulate that policy. So there are very, very real U.S. commitments to Taiwan. So it's a completely different set of circumstances. It's fascinating, and as we're learning over the past couple of days, these are conflicts that would quite literally operate in different centuries. Russia, I believe, has sort of been, win or lose, has already been humiliated by this conflict. The level of electronic warfare, missile warfare, A2AD, high tech. China versus the U.S. over Taiwan would be a very 21st century war. And I think it's very clear here. And I don't know, to the extent that the Chinese, my understanding is, I could be wrong about this, is that they have a lot of military technology. They're now developing their own in serious ways, but they have a lot of military technology that they got from Russia. And if Russia is sort of the big donor of their high tech, if Russia is their big, um, hey, Chris Tandall, I would not, please don't spam the chat. Chris Tandall, don't spam the chat. Don't spam the chat. I'm putting, wow, sorry, Logo, I'm actually going to moderate for once. I'm putting that user in a timeout. Oh no, that's a lot of spamming. You should, Logo, why don't you just block them? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, do not spam the chat. Anyway, where were we? What were we talking about? We were talking about, oh wait, there was a super chat I missed. I'm sorry. We were talking about China. Yeah, we're talking about the difference between the Taiwan. So yeah, the Chinese military, my understanding is a lot of their technology is from the Russian military. And I kind of wonder if they're like, wait, what the fuck? What was sold to us? I don't know how true that is. But yeah, I do not think, as I've discussed earlier, Russia was in a position where they lost, with every year going forward, they could see losing the ability to attack Ukraine. China, with every year that goes forward, they add to their resilience against the blockade, the international blockade that would absolutely come if they attempted to invade Taiwan. So no, I'm not worried. I forgot True Realist super chat. Shit, sorry. Where are we? True Realist. How can Putin walk away from this and save face? That's a good question. How can Putin walk away from this and save face? Man, I don't fucking know. I think Putin internationally has made himself a bit of a pariah. I mean, obviously the Syrians have to keep talking to him. But yeah, there's a lot of damage that Putin has done to himself here. I think that, as I said, I'm really interested to see what I'm sure Orban, or maybe Orban's being very quiet. Viktor Orban of Hungary has really distinguished himself by being the EU leader who's most friendly with Putin, most interested in being pals with Putin. I mean, it's worth remembering that 15 years ago, Putin was not a pariah. I mean, there was this really amusing photo series I saw on Twitter of like Silvio Berlusconi and Vladimir Putin apparently used to be great pals, and now Viktor Orban was probably the only person who was eager to have a friendly photo shoot with Russia. As of this week, it's fucking nobody. I think it should be really interesting. I wonder if there's actually electoral consequences for Orban and his closeness to Vladimir Putin now. Yeah, so I think that I don't know. I certainly have more faith in Putin's power within Russia than a lot of people seem to. I think it is inspiring. It's great. They're very brave. The sort of thousands of Russians who have been who have gone to jail because of their protests against Russia, against Putin's war. But I don't really see him as shaky in Russia yet. But yeah, I think there's a lot of folks who are willing to take Putin seriously, willing to work with Putin as a sort of interlocutor or alternative to the West, who have got to be thinking about it a lot more differently. Is really phenomenal. You've probably all seen it at this point. There was that clip going around from the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations. Just really quickly laying out here. It's like, look, yeah, like borders suck sometimes. We get it. Like practically every border in Africa is split up an ethnic group or a tribe, and that's terrible. Which is essentially what Russia's grievance is about Ukraine. But look, like borders are borders. Changing them is imperialism, and we must condemn this war. I've done a terrible job describing it, but I feel like, yeah, this is naked imperialism. I think Russia. This channel is an example of how Russia did have a lot, not in the United States for sure, but across the world had a lot of support because he was seen as someone with some anti-imperialist bona fides, someone who worked against imperialism. And that's over, man. That's done. He's like I said, he's as nasty international actor as Mohammed bin Salman for sure. I think okay. So I got that. Were there other super chats I missed? Do you think the Pacific Lukashenko got that one? Sarah Posala, could China use this opportunity to rebuild trust and mend relations with? Oh, that's an interesting question. Could China use this opportunity to rebuild trust and mend relations with the United States, and will it? Why? No. I mean, maybe. I don't think so. It depends on how horrific things get. If Putin's invasion in Ukraine gets so nasty that even the Chinese have to be like, whoa, okay, and actually decide to come out for sanctions or that sort of thing, incredibly unlikely. That just doesn't seem like something China would do. So I think what's very likely is that China is going to be able to avoid, what's the word I'm looking for here? China is going to be able to China is going to have a couple years now where there's much more scrutiny on Russia than China. It will benefit from that. It will, I think, have the ability and time, if they have any sense, to clean up its act in certain arenas. But I think there's going to be a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who are going to work very hard to demonize China for its relationship with Russia. Because it's possible we could get to a place in a couple of years where actually Europe has made serious efforts and can do serious sanctions against Russian oil and gas, and China's probably just going to keep sucking up all that oil and gas. To be clear, they'd need to build more pipelines to do it. I think they said something like, I was just reading The Economist, and Russia apparently only takes, China apparently only takes like 27% of the amount of imports as the European Union does. And of course, that figure doesn't include Ukraine, Belarus, Ukraine and Belarus, which also take a ton, or Turkey, which also take a F ton of Russian oil and gas imports. So, I think what's going to happen is that China will continue to be demonized for its support of Russia, but in a smaller way for its actual actions. I think this is a real opportunity for China to sort of rebuild, move beyond the wolf warrior phase. But as far as improving relationships with the United States, I'm less confident. And maybe it's possible, but it seems unlikely to me. There was another super chat, wasn't there? Wasn't there? I thought there was. Brando Commando, yes. Looks like Russia is going to. Yeah, it looks like Russia is going to carpet bomb Kyiv and Ukrainian civilians if the resistance doesn't let up. Heavy losses incoming. That is incredibly sad. Yeah, Russia carpet bombing Kyiv. Yeah, it's incredibly sad. I mean, to be clear, the United States essentially carpet bombed Mosul, Fallujah, a lot of places, and that was horrific. But unlike those examples, everyone's going to be paying attention when Russia carpet bombs Kyiv. And yeah, if Russia carpet bombs Kyiv, then yeah, there's going to be tremendous pressure on China to not be as close. The problem is, of course, and I haven't talked about this much, is Europe is not going to stop buying oil and gas from Russia. The United States hasn't stopped taking oil and gas from Russia. It's kind of crazy. I missed the Star Parcel super chat. No, I did that China. Okay, that was the China thing. Anything else that I missed? Super chats get priority, folks. Yes. Okay, it's time to start spieling. I've been doing this for 2 hours. I've been tremendously grateful. I've still got 190 folks here on YouTube and 260 on TikTok. Geez, where's the question? Let me do a TikTok question or two. Do you think any thoughts on Imran Khan's visit to Russia? No, I don't. That is interesting, though. That Pakistan is certainly more oriented to China, which means that he's more willing to cozy up with with Russia, which is a fascinating development. Pakistan was traditionally always aligned with the United States, whereas India was more aligned with Russia, and that is changing in very real ways. True realist, this is not Iraq invading Kuwait. Russia is a big superpower. So how can the West realistically move forward? I don't foresee the West going to. Oh, of course not. No, no, no question. No, like the Ukrainians are on their own, for sure. I think that there's, I think there's scope for. God, it's such a weird fucking thing, but I am. I expect and hope that the CIA is right now setting up rat lines and has relationships to get arms to insurgents. I think there's been a big discussion in the Biden administration about arming a potential insurgency in Ukraine presumably after the Russians have conquered a bunch of stuff. There's been a lot of talk about that, but I think what's probable is that the Biden administration will say, "Yeah, no, I'm sorry, we can't do it. It would just put NATO on the hook, and it would risk too much war. So the United States will be unable to arm the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian insurgency. We're not going to do it, and then the CIA will do it." And I'm down with that. I think that makes sense. I think, yeah, the Biden administration will probably have to lie about arming the insurgency, saying they're not doing it, and the CIA will arm the insurgency. But yeah, no, for sure, there's not going to be open arming of the insurgency by Biden or Europe. There's not going to be a no-fly zone. Is lunatics proposing that? There's certainly not going to be U.S. involvement. There's a risk. I worry a lot about Poland or probably not one of the Baltics, specifically Poland overcommitting NATO, basically taking some kind of, getting involved in some way in this conflict. And then, of course, Russia retaliating, and then I guess we're obligated to do World War III. That's really scary. What's the word I'm looking for here? But yeah, I do not see the West going to war here. It's just not going to happen. But people are really, really, really going to dislike that. Anyway, so yeah, I think I have answered that super chat. Should I do another TikTok question? Because I haven't done many TikTok questions, and there's 200 of you. If NATO becomes involved, Russia will nuke NATO out of existence. Yeah, I don't think so. Put simply. Yeah, I think if NATO becomes involved, human civilization ends, is actually what happens. Russia gets nuked out of existence too. So yeah, more freedom for. If Russia eventually loses the war, what would it mean for its small allied countries, like Algeria, for example? I think those small allied countries, Syria doesn't have the choice, but I think the smart thing to do at this point for any small allied country with Russia, sort of Algeria, is to run in the other direction. And Algeria has a pretty close relationship with the United States. I would go do that. I mean, it is frustrating because I spend a lot of time arguing against U.S. empire, not U.S. hegemony, not U.S. dominance. I like that. And I do think that U.S. hegemony has been better for the most other, but I am against U.S. militarization of things. Or like the idea that a country like Algeria has to be scared into being allies with the United States. I hate that. My channel is against that sort of thing and will continue to be against that sort of thing. But Vladimir Putin, as he has for his entire fucking career, has dropped a tremendous gift in the hands of U.S. militarists. And at this point, as we're actually watching a place get bombed, I can't... how can you say the Russian military is bad while they took over a country in 2 days? You must be reading different media, because I do not see Russia taking over a country in 2 days. I expected Russia to take over a country in 12 hours. We are 2 days later, and they are nowhere near there. Okay, I think unless anybody's got a super chat, I'm just going to start spieling, and then bail. You can keep me talking with more super chats. Anyway, My name is Robert Morris. I upload a video every Tuesday since March of 2014 talking about geopolitics. I'm becoming more knowledgeable on Russia and Ukraine as I follow this news, but I'm traditionally a little more Middle East oriented. I know a lot about European history too, as well, however. Um, Also cover U.S. politics. Regardless, it's every Tuesday. I try to say something interesting about the world with a geopolitics focus. I hope you'll join me there on YouTube at More Freedom Foundation. It's Mo Freedom Foundation on YouTube. On TikTok, it is More Freedom Foundation. I upload twice a day on TikTok. I've now been uploading daily on YouTube, just shorts, but it's the Tuesday video I tend to focus on. I did a produced video this past Tuesday, so it'll probably be an unproduced one next Tuesday, but let's see what I can accomplish. Perhaps I'll be inspired. Regardless, please subscribe on YouTube at Mo Freedom Foundation. Please subscribe on TikTok at More Freedom Foundation. Please get on my Instagram. That's also More Freedom Foundation. I intend to do more with that in the coming weeks and months. We have this channel is supported entirely by PayPal and by Patreon. If you are willing to sign on Patreon, you help me eat. You help me. You basically increase the longevity of this channel. I'm still sort of working off of savings and progressively more Patreon funding. There will come a point where I've decided I've used too many savings. That point is further in the distance the more money that comes through Patreon. So keep me going with super chats, Patreon, PayPal. If you join Patreon, we've been doing we've been doing multiple live chats because of the Ukraine emergency, but usually I only do one public live chat a month. I do multiple. Actually, yeah, at this point I do multiple live chats with the patrons each month. Folks ask me to cover a whole bunch of stuff, and there's no way I can cover all the countries and regions, but one day a month I try for the patrons only newscast. And then at the patrons only newscast, I try to cover everything that the patrons want me to cover, which means I spend a morning just sort of spending 20 minutes researching one thing, 20 minutes researching the one thing. It's a lot of fun, helps me actually get a broader picture of the world, and it's a lot of fun for patrons. I interact with every single comment in the chat. That's once a month, but you need to sign up for Patreon to get access to that. This coming Sunday, actually, I have a different patrons only thing on the Discord. It's basically like a Zoom call. We all sort of hop on. I don't prepare anything. We basically just shoot the shit for a while on the patrons only I call it a Zoom call. It's basically usually only I've only got 100 patrons. Usually only 6 to 8 people show up, but we just talk, and it's from people from all over the world. I get to see the faces, hear the voices of patrons, which I really appreciate. That's available to all patrons, and you can join us too at noon on Sunday if you sign up on Patreon, and you will get a link to the Discord. Okay, I think that's most of the spieling I have to do. Oh, of course, you can follow me on Twitter at RoboLaw, where I have been somewhat exhaustingly following the conflict in Ukraine and have been attempting to surface worthwhile, interesting information. And that's what I spend way too much time on Twitter all the time. Yes, as Logo Cool Extreme says, join the Patreon, folks. Join the MFF Discord server. We're having a group chat on Sunday with Rob, and you can bully him in person. These are all opportunities that you have. Thank you to Logo for his moderating job. Thank you all for being here. This has been great. It's always a little awkward to find oneself in the position of profiting from horror and destruction. Unfortunately, that's sort of where I'm at. But I do believe that we do get out higher quality information than many do. And of course, let's close with thoughts or prayers, if that's your bag, for the people of Ukraine. It's certainly a tremendously interesting thing. There's something about the human mind that gravitates towards war, but it's truly horrific. Just thinking of the people that are killed here, that are being killed here. It is, as we should of course think of Yemen, of Syria, of Ethiopia, of any place in the planet where there is war. But I do believe, beyond the fact that, oh, it's white people, there is something unique about seeing two basically 20th century armies battle each other. And we could see Kyiv destroyed today. Um, it's a beautiful city I've been to, and that's a horrifying thing. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here. And with that depressing note, as we should end on a depressing note, war is horror. I think I will say good afternoon. Thank you for being here.